A UK government survey has found that more than 84% of women feel like they're not listened to by healthcare professionals. Now, we did our own poll on this and asked you at home, have you ever felt dismissed by a doctor? And 77% of you said yes. There are things, I'm sure that some of you in the audience may well have experienced that yourself, but I definitely experienced it last year when I had an awful reaction around my eyes. I think I've mentioned this on the panel before. And I went to my GP about it, and what they did was they gave me a steroid cream on my eyes, and you shouldn't really have heavy and very strong steroid creams around your eyes, and it burnt all around my eyes. So I then had to go and see a specialist who said it had nothing to do with the external. Essentially, my body was shutting down, and I was so tired and not getting much sleep. I was low in loads of vitamins and all of this stuff. And she said that if I hadn't sorted it out, I would have collapsed in a couple of years and I wouldn't have known the reason why.
Was that a GP gave you the cream?
The GP gave me the cream, so they were looking at the external rather than the internal, and didn't really ask any other questions about it whatsoever. So then I went to see a specialist because it was so bad that my eyes were, the skin underneath my eyes were weeping so much I couldn't put makeup on because it wouldn't stick to my face. Wow. But they didn't look into it in any way, shape or form, but it turned out that it was a sign of my body slowly but surely shutting down. Wow. But I had to go and see a specialist in order to be able to get it sorted out. And I feel so much better now, but I just felt as though in the initial GP appointment that they didn't really take it very seriously, when it turns out my body was in a seriously bad
Did you have
condition.
to go and look yourself then to find out what vitamins you were deficient in?
Yes.
And,
Yeah, and I feel so much healthier now and I don't feel as run down. I'm getting loads more sleep, and it hasn't happened since in the 18 months since I got it sorted and went to see a specialist about it. But, you know, it's that idea that you can feel as though something's wrong and you know something's wrong, but someone doesn't necessarily realise the gravitas of the situation or help you to figure that out, which can be difficult, right?
I think that I would agree with that, because I push myself really hard, and I work, you know, for my age, I do push myself really hard, and I've felt over the last few years from time to time pretty washed out. But then what I've done is you know, I can afford to pay for blood tests, and I've felt there is some underlying thing wrong, but I've never been able to actually pinpoint what it might be. But in the end, it comes down to you have to own your own health. And my message today to viewers would be, own your own health. Don't be frightened to ask questions and keep pushing like you did. Keep going and seeing a specialist. And when you finally get to see a specialist, record what they're saying, what their diagnosis is. Because I remember with my mother, years and years ago, she went to see an eye specialist, and he told her quite categorically that she did not have a tumour behind her eye, but she did not record it. And she got completely the wrong end of the stick. And I think that this is, if you get to see a consultant, ask loads of questions, but also record what they're telling you and what they say.
I completely agree with you that you have to take some responsibility, well, a lot of responsibility for your own health. There's no point eating and drinking everything in sight and then saying, you know, I can't walk properly when it's a case of morbid obesity. But also that is sometimes a mental illness as well, and emotional support has to be available. I think the time I remember most vividly of being let down by a doctor was when I was severely poorly with postnatal depression after the birth of Matty, which I've talked extensively about, and to Rosanna when we first met, extensively about on this show. And my mum took me to the doctor. I was almost catatonic. I was apparently on the verge of a puerperal psychosis. I was very, very, very poorly. And my mother was kind of talking for me. And the GP, a woman in her mid-60s, probably not far from my age now, leant forward and said to me, well, I had 5 children, dear, and I just didn't have time to get depressed. Is what she said to me, and that's what I was faced with a lot. And also because my depression was either hormonal or chemical, it was endogenous, it wasn't necessarily based in trauma. I have spent all of the time over my life trying to convince people that this comes on of its own accord. It doesn't always have a reason. That's not of as much negligence as sometimes a lot of doctors just don't know.
You know, I mentioned we're going to be talking about lots of very in-depth conversations regarding lots of things to do with women's health. And supermodel Bella Hadid has actually brought this up. It was in Vogue not that long ago. She prompted a lot of debate for saying that women should get time off when having their period, when menstruating. In an interview with Vogue, Bella, who lives with endometriosis and polycystic ovary syndrome, has said it should be illegal to model while on her period. Now, whether you agree with it or not, it does bring up interesting questions about whether or not we should be so open or feel we can be open about things like periods and, you know, she says, have time off work.
I think it's a really fine line. I think one that we need to tread really carefully, because I feel like we don't want to walk into the hands of misogynistic creators we have in our space now who like to basically deem women incapable to do certain jobs or fill certain roles in society, and they disregard us and they go, well, because she's menstrual, because all the rest of it. I think by sometimes those kind of narratives, I think, are actually going to push us back, and we're playing into the hands of those kind of misogynistic people. And women are more than capable of managing their menstrual cycle and showing up in society just as well, if not better than men. Having said that is on one end of the scale, and that's what I'm talking with someone who has, aka, a normal period, a normal menstrual cycle. My sister, who I've spoken about on here before with her permission, has endometriosis, you know, at one of the highest grades, and she's had multiple surgeries, and she, you know, faced many years of pushback of, you know, doctors not taking her seriously. She had to go down different avenues, take matters into her own hands, and then finally get, you know, surgeries to remove cysts. So I think when you have an endometriosis or a polycystic ovaries type of situation, your periods and the way they show up are very different, and that will affect your ability to work as well. Yeah, no, without a shadow of a doubt. I mean, the Labour government has said that they're bringing in various different different things into the system to try and improve the outcomes for women when it comes to things like heavy periods and things like polycystic ovaries and endometriosis. But do you think it's that they've left it not too late, but women have had to go through all these things without, you know, for many, many years without all this extra help? I know, as a female boss, when women who work for me said they couldn't work because their periods were so bad or they were in such pain, I like to think I was accommodating and receptive, but you have to accept that some bosses would be suspicious and they would log it and they would monitor it because, you know, there will be some people in the system that abuse it. But when you read about the court cases of women who suffered, you know, unfair dismissal, who had to go to employment tribunals because they were accused of taking too much time off for their periods or for the menopause, you realise that to go to a tribunal is an extreme thing because all your medical history will be laid out. It'll be an awful experience. So I think bosses just have to accommodate women who can't fulfil their job to 100% in the office. They might be able to fulfil it at home, who knows? But at the same time, I do think it is very, very late in the day. And I know from close friends, I mean, I've got a hairdresser who told me recently that she was having most terrible, terrible bleeding, and she went into an A&E department on her way home. She got out of a cab and said, please, please, please help me. I need some pads. And they said, we haven't got any here. Now, that is shocking. Well, the Department of Health has said we're making progress by adding 3 million extra appointments and investing over £100 million into improving things like maternity units, for example, to try and reverse some of the outcomes, especially when it comes to black maternal care. But records show that waiting lists for gynaecology appointments across the UK have more than doubled in the last 5 years, with problems ranging from, as we've mentioned before, endometriosis to incontinence, which does affect about 3 million women in the UK. Now, it can be an embarrassing topic to talk about, but it's an important one to discuss, and it's one that you've been really open about, Denzi.
I have. I mean, I can't remember when I didn't wet myself, to be honest, or a giggle dribble, as we call it. Because I have a kind of that sense of humour, I have, you know, used this show as one of many, you know, platforms to be able to talk about incontinence because I'm not embarrassed about it. But having talked openly, if ever I've done a talk anywhere and I've talked about, you know, weeing myself, So many people have either got in touch with me online or come up to me and said, thank you so much for talking about it. I've dealt with this for years. We assume it's often post-childbirth, but actually, you know, there are people in their teenage years who, for all sorts of reasons, suffer from incontinence. And because it's embarrassing, people don't talk about it and don't look for help. And there are lots of ways that we can help ourselves. You call it Kegels. Janet and I had never heard of Kegels as regards...
I thought it was a new breakfast cereal.
I don't know if that's a new...
Have you had your Kegels this morning? Because we called it it was just pelvic floor exercises.
Well, I don't know if that's like an Americanised term or if that is like just a new term, but when I was making the documentary that I made about plastic surgery and we did a vagina episode, seeing those women and seeing that they're striving for surgery, whether it was cosmetic related or, you know, functional, I was literally, my eyes were opened up to like, OK, is incontinence something that we all actually need to be thinking about? Me in my early 30s, not had kids. I'd never thought about it. The only time I've thought about it is when I've had too much to drink. So I was like, you know, that is something that I was educated to. And then my gynaecologist, I was with him one day and he put his hands down my stomach. He said, can you sit up? And I was like, yeah, because he was checking my core. And he was like, are you doing your Kegels? And I was like, am I doing my what? And he was like, are you doing pelvic floor exercises? I said, no, should I be? And he was like, yes, you want to have kids in the next couple of years, start now.
Basically, you've just got to cleanse.
I was like, yeah. Just
but also, what we eat and drink really affects our bladder that I didn't really know about because we don't talk about it enough.
No. But we've got Dr. Rosanna in the audience. Kegels, pelvic floor exercises, the same thing?
Yeah, pretty much so. And I do think it's important to start early, I think, when you first find out about them. And not every woman that actually goes on to have children will go on to have any form of urinary incontinence. Some people say that it is the pushing out of the baby if you're having a normal vaginal delivery. I hate that expression because if you've had to have like an emergency section like me, you're made to feel abnormal. And others say that it is actually the weight of carrying the child for 9 months. But there are lots of other reasons why people can get incontinence.
So what would you recommend that somebody that does have it, what should they be doing?
Well, obviously, there is a range. There are some people who have a little, giggle sprinkle and can put a pad in and it's actually easy to manage. But for others, it is totally debilitating for their life. And when that happens, it is really important that they go and see their GP and go and have a proper consultation with a gynaecologist because sometimes, not in every case, but sometimes you can have surgery and that can really, really improve the situation for you. But it's so important to understand that you don't have to go through it alone. Yeah. So many women at all sorts of ages are living with it.
Yeah, and both Denzi and Liv have spoken about just the numbers that are affected by this.